At 8:20 a.m. on a quiet suburban street, the morning school run stands as the ultimate symbol of safety. Children strapped into car seats, backpacks on the floorboards, a mother at the wheel. But on February 19th, 2020, that sanctuary was instantly vaporized. Residents of Camp Hill were jolted by an explosion, followed by a thick wall of black smoke. A white SUV was entirely engulfed in flames, with 3 young children and their mother trapped inside. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was an ambush. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Rowan Baxter's identity was constructed on an entirely different foundation: the exertion of absolute physical dominance. A native of New Zealand, he carved out a space for himself on the brutal, high-impact battlefields of professional rugby league. Earning a contract with the New Zealand Warriors, he lived in a world where aggression was monetized and vulnerability was an exploitable weakness. When his professional sporting career eventually faded, he seamlessly pivoted into the local fitness industry, bringing that same combative intensity with him. Baxter was the quintessential charismatic coach. He possessed the heavily muscled physique, the confident swagger, and the loud motivational rhetoric that commanded immediate attention on the gym floor. To the casual observer, he was an inspirational figure, a man of unwavering discipline who could push clients to their absolute limits. But the psychological framework required to survive professional contact, sports often conceals a dangerous rigidity. The traits that ensure survival on the field, a refusal to yield, an obsession with winning, the demand for total environmental control, can become a catastrophic liability behind closed doors. Baxter didn't simply prefer having his way, he required total submission. His charm was not a reflection of empathy. It was a highly effective tactical instrument. He used it to disarm critics, attract followers, and mask a deeply ingrained narcissism. Those who spent enough time in his orbit eventually noticed that his affability was purely conditional. As long as you followed his script and validated his superiority, he was the perfect gentleman. The moment you deviated, the warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating punisher. Hannah's dedication to health and physical training meant her path was destined to cross with the local fitness community's elite. As she navigated her 20s, she was actively looking to build a vibrant, healthy life. She wanted a true partnership, someone to share early morning workouts, family dinners, and the eventual responsibilities of raising children. She brought an open, trusting vulnerability to her interactions, assuming others operated with the same fundamental decency she did. Baxter, conversely, was scanning the horizon for something very different. He wasn't seeking an equal, he was looking for an asset. He needed a partner who would elevate his social status, reflect his obsession with physical perfection, and most importantly, submit entirely to his governance. The stage was set for a devastating collision between a woman who lived to nurture and a man who lived only to conquer. The connection occurred in the exact environment where both felt most formidable: the gym floor. In the late 2000s, Hannah was an energetic, highly respected presence in the local fitness community, while Baxter was transitioning out of his professional rugby career into personal training. Their introduction seemed entirely organic. To Hannah, Rowan appeared as a driven, passionate athlete who inherently understood her intense dedication to health. He mirrored her interests flawlessly, matching her vibrant energy with his own brand of extreme focus. During those early months, the attention he showered on her felt intoxicating. He was protective, deeply interested in her daily routines, and seemingly devoted to building a shared future. It is a psychological hallmark of coercive control. The initial phase is rarely marked by fear. Instead, it is characterized by an overwhelming, all-consuming affection that quietly begins to sever a victim's outside ties under the guise of an inseparable romance. They married in 2012, cementing what appeared to the public to be a flawless partnership. Over the next few years, the couple welcomed 3 children into their lives. On paper, they were a modern suburban success story. They combined their professional passions to open a fitness center. To the casual member walking through the doors, the owners were a powerhouse duo. They built a lucrative brand around physical excellence, strict discipline, and wholesome family values. But the business served a much darker, dual purpose for Rowan. It was not simply a source of joint income. It was an architectural mechanism for total financial and professional surveillance. Because they worked in the same building, Hannah was never out of his sight. He positioned himself as the face and primary authority of the gym, while systematically reducing his wife to a subordinate administrative role. He controlled the company's finances, which seamlessly translated into absolute control over her personal access to money. The isolation began with imperceptible, highly calculated shifts. A disparaging comment about a lifelong friend here. A manufactured, exhausting argument before a family gathering there. Baxter subtly manipulated the domestic environment so that Hannah found it easier to simply stay home rather than endure the inevitable conflict of socializing without him. He required her to delete her personal social media accounts, replacing them with a joint profile that he monitored constantly. He scrutinized her wardrobe, dictating exactly what was appropriate for a mother and a fitness professional to wear. If she wore athletic gear that he deemed too revealing, he would publicly humiliate her in front of gym members, framing his aggressive jealousy as a righteous standard of professional modesty. The psychological grip tightened relentlessly as the years progressed. Baxter began tracking her movements using phone applications and GPS tracking under the heavy-handed pretense of keeping her safe. He would intercept her text messages and demand passwords to every digital facet of her life. The financial abuse deepened into absolute deprivation. Hannah was not allowed access to their joint bank accounts without his explicit, itemized permission. She was forced to ask for grocery money. When she was permitted to go to the supermarket, he timed her trips down to the minute. If she took too long, she returned to a barrage of interrogations and wild accusations of infidelity. He weaponized intimacy and his sheer physical size, standing in doorways to block her exit during arguments, using his heavily muscled frame to physically intimidate without ever throwing a punch. This was a deliberate, chilling calculation. He knew exactly how to inflict maximum emotional terror without leaving the physical bruises that law enforcement could easily act upon. He constantly told her that she was nothing without him, that her family didn't actually care about her, and that she was an incompetent mother. Over a decade, this relentless psychological battery eroded her self-esteem, trapping her in a claustrophobic labyrinth of self-doubt and manufactured guilt. By late 2019, the atmosphere inside their home had become suffocating. The emotional terror was absolute, and it was no longer contained just to Hannah. Baxter began subjecting the children to his rigid, unpredictable demands, using them as emotional pawns to punish their mother. If she stepped out of line, he withheld affection from the kids or leveraged their natural love for him against her. It was this specific dynamic that finally snapped the tether. Hannah realized that her children were absorbing this toxicity as their baseline for normalcy, that her daughters were learning this was what a relationship looked like, and her son was being taught that this was how a man asserts power. Hannah began quietly laying the groundwork for an exit. It required terrifying precision. Victims of coercive control understand that the most dangerous moment of their lives is the exact point of departure. She secretly confided in her parents, finally peeling back the curtain on the true extent of her captivity. Her family immediately rallied, providing an unconditional safe haven. In early December 2019, seizing a narrow window of opportunity while her husband was distracted, Hannah executed her escape. She packed whatever essentials she could quickly fit into her vehicle, strapped the children into their car seats, and drove away from the marital home. She left behind the business she helped build, her financial security, and the hollow illusion of the perfect family. She sought immediate refuge at her parents' house, moving to file for a domestic violence order and initiating the harrowing process of untangling her life from a man who viewed her not as a human being, but as his exclusive property. He was waiting, hidden from view, tracking her daily routine with the cold precision of a predator. He had calculated the exact route, the exact intersection, the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. As the heavy vehicle slowed near a corner, the passenger door was suddenly and violently yanked open. He forced his way inside. The intrusion was physical, immediate, and utterly calculated. He didn't come to argue. He didn't come to negotiate custody or plead for reconciliation. He came with a heavy plastic jerry can. Panic instantly flooded the confined cabin. Realizing the catastrophic threat sitting mere inches away, she gripped the steering wheel and mashed her foot against the accelerator. The engine roared. The SUV lurched violently forward, jumping the concrete curb. She deliberately drove the vehicle into a neighbor's parked car, hoping the jarring impact of the crash would stall his momentum, hoping the crunch of twisting metal would draw the neighborhood outside. It did not stop him. He ignored the collision. He unscrewed the cap. He tipped the heavy container. Gallons of liquid splashed violently across the center console. It soaked the upholstery. It saturated her clothing. The fluid splashed backward into the rear cabin where the 3 children were firmly strapped down. The heavy, noxious fumes sucked the oxygen from the enclosed space instantly. The smell of unleaded gasoline was suffocating, chemical, sharp, burning the eyes and lungs, signaling absolute doom. He produced a lighter. The flick of the flint was barely audible over the screaming. Then, ignition. Fire does not simply burn in a confined space drenched in chemical accelerant. It detonates. The interior of the SUV transformed instantly into a roaring inferno. Temperatures inside the cabin spiked to thousands of degrees Fahrenheit within fractions of a second. The air itself caught fire. The massive displacement of thermal pressure blew the tempered safety windows outward, showering the asphalt with shattered glass. A thick, impenetrable wall of black, toxic smoke aggressively spiraled into the sky, blotting out the morning sun. Inside the vehicle, survival became a physiological impossibility. The heat was absolute. Plastic dashboard fixtures warped, bubbled, and liquefied. The heavy-duty nylon seatbelts fused and locked. The electronic wiring of the doors fried instantly, turning the heavy metal frame into an inescapable cage. The child locks remained engaged. The vehicle became a vault of fire. Through sheer, unimaginable adrenaline, she somehow managed to force her door open. She tumbled out onto the hard asphalt. Her clothing was heavily alight. She rolled on the pavement, screaming for her children, the desperate maternal instinct overriding the total destruction of her own body. The neighborhood, jolted by the explosive concussion and the grinding crash, rushed from their homes. A man who had been washing his car dropped his sponge and sprinted toward the blazing wreckage with a garden hose, spraying water over her charred form, desperately trying to extinguish the flames eating through her skin. Another resident grabbed a household fire extinguisher, rushing the vehicle, trying to penetrate the wall of heat to reach the back seat. It was utterly futile. The thermal radiation was too intense. The sheer wall of heat pushed them backward, singeing their hair, blistering their faces. Approaching within 10 feet felt like stepping into an open blast furnace. The roaring jet engine sound of the chemical fire drowned out all reason. And then there was the assailant. He had managed to exit the passenger side. His own body was severely burned, but he was highly mobile. He did not move to help. He did not move to open the rear doors. Instead, he aggressively returned to the burning wreckage to retrieve a knife from the front seat. When panicked neighbors tried to intervene, when they tried to drag the garden hose closer to the windows, he physically charged at them. He stood as a barrier between the rescuers and the burning tomb of his own children. He shouted at the bystanders, commanding them to back away. He demanded that the destruction run its full course. Realizing the fire had completed its horrific task, he finally stepped away from the inferno. He stumbled toward the sidewalk, collapsing onto the concrete just a few yards from the burning metal. Gripping the blade he had retrieved from the cabin, he inflicted a fatal wound to his own chest. He bled out onto the pavement, ensuring he would never face a courtroom, never look a jury in the eye, and never answer for the massacre. It was his final, cowardly assertion of absolute control. But the mother did not die on the asphalt. Her physical injuries were catastrophic. Deep, full-thickness burns covered 97% of her body. The pain receptors in her skin were completely incinerated, leaving her in a terrifying state of hyperlucid shock. As emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, echoing off the suburban houses, she sat upright on the curb. Bystanders continued to pour buckets of water over her smoking frame, weeping openly, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the tableau. When the first police cruisers screeched to a halt and paramedics rushed the scene with medical kits, they expected a victim succumbing to the overwhelming trauma. They expected incoherence, unconsciousness, or delirium. Instead, They found a woman powered by a terrifying final surge of protective rage. She looked directly at the first responders. Her voice was remarkably steady, cutting clearly through the chaos, the crackling of the dying fire, and the frantic shouts of the tactical units securing the perimeter. She did not ask for painkillers. She did not ask about her own survival. She gave them the complete narrative of the crime in precise, declarative statements. She told the officers that he poured the fuel. She told them that he ignited the flame. She explicitly gave them his identity, ensuring the legal record would reflect his exact actions. Even as her organs began to fail and her body shut down, her mind remained razor sharp. She ensured that the narrative of this day would never belong to him. She made certain there would be no ambiguity, no alternative police theories, and no post-mortem defense of a tragic accident. She delivered her own dying declaration with perfect clarity. Only after the paramedics loaded her onto the stretcher, initiating aggressive airway management and pumping her veins with heavy narcotics, did that superhuman adrenaline finally begin to ebb. The fire eventually smothered itself, starved of its chemical accelerant, leaving behind a blackened, smoking steel skeleton sitting incongruously on a manicured suburban street. Water from the frantic, futile rescue attempts pooled with oil and gasoline runoff, forming a toxic, iridescent slurry that trickled slowly into the storm drains. The acrid stench of melted plastic, scorched rubber, and unspent fuel hung heavy in the warm morning air. A permanent sensory anchor that would haunt the responding officers for the rest of their careers. For the residents of Camp Hill, the inherent safety of their neighborhood had been permanently shattered. Bystanders who had sprinted from their driveways, armed with nothing but household fire extinguishers and desperate courage, now stood paralyzed behind expanding rings of yellow police tape. The adrenaline crash left them shivering despite the heat. Men who had charged the inferno, blistering their own hands on the superheated door handles, sat on the curbs in stunned silence. Some wept openly into their shirts. Others stared vacantly at the wreckage, their minds unable to process the absolute failure of their intervention. The social echo of the event was immediate and profound. They had not merely witnessed a tragedy, they had been forced into the front row of a calculated massacre, helpless to stop the obliteration of a mother and her children. Uniformed officers rapidly locked down a multi-block radius. The chaotic shouts of the initial emergency response faded, replaced by the grim, methodical quiet of a major crime scene protocol. Tarps were erected. Media helicopters had already begun circling overhead, their rotors chopping through the dissipating smoke, broadcasting the charred shell of the SUV to a horrified public. Detectives from the homicide squad arrived, walking the perimeter, taking in the proximity of the suspect's lifeless body on the sidewalk. There was no manhunt required. The perpetrator had served as his own executioner, leaving the justice system with nothing but the smoldering wreckage of a fractured family. Forensics teams stepped carefully through the debris field, marking the trajectory of the vehicle, the impact point on the parked car, and the discarded jerry can. The physical evidence perfectly corroborated the dying declaration the victim had just delivered to the first responders. Miles away, inside the back of a speeding ambulance, the fight for survival was deeply clinical and inherently doomed. The rig tore through the morning traffic, its sirens screaming a continuous warning as the driver pushed the heavy vehicle toward the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. In the rear compartment, paramedics worked with frantic precision to stabilize a physiological collapse. The injuries were beyond the scope of standard trauma medicine. With 97% of her skin destroyed, the body's primary defense mechanism against infection and fluid loss was entirely gone. The medics focused exclusively on airway management and intravenous resuscitation, acutely aware that the thermal damage to her throat would soon cause catastrophic swelling, sealing off her windpipe. Even underneath the heavy, suppressive fog of clinical narcotics, her vital signs presented a terrifying readout of systemic shock. Her blood pressure cratered as her vascular system leaked fluid into the surrounding tissues. The radio transmissions between the ambulance and the emergency room were clipped. Stripped of all standard medical optimism, the receiving physicians were instantly placed on standby for the most extreme classification of burn casualty. She was rushed through the automatic doors of the trauma bay, and immediately transferred into the highly regulated, sterile environment of the intensive care unit. Medical personnel swarmed the bed. She was promptly placed into a deep, medically induced coma. This was a necessary intervention designed to shield her brain from the incomprehensible threshold of physical agony and to allow mechanical ventilators to force steady, measured breaths into her compromised lungs. The hospital corridors, typically defined by hushed efficiency and routine, absorbed the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of incoming devastation. Detectives had already made the most difficult phone call in law enforcement to her parents. The drive to the hospital for the family was an agonizing suspension of reality, a claustrophobic limbo bridging the moment they received the news and the visual confirmation waiting for them in the ward. When the family was finally permitted to enter the intensive care unit, the clinical humming of the life support machinery provided a cold, rhythmic soundtrack to their grief. The vibrant, athletic woman who had been the structural foundation of their family was now obscured beneath thick layers of pristine white medical dressing, tethered to a complex array of monitors and plastic tubing. The physicians were candid. The medical reality was completely irreversible. The cellular destruction was too absolute, and multi-organ failure was already cascading through her system. There were no surgical options left, no aggressive therapies that could rebuild what the chemical fire had consumed. The medical staff quietly stepped back, dimming the harsh fluorescent lights, allowing the family the sacred, agonizing space to surround the bed. They stood vigil through the afternoon and into the early evening, speaking softly to her, providing the only comfort left to give. In the quiet glow of the monitors, her heart rate began to slow, steadily dropping as her body finally surrendered the fight. Later that night, the screen flatlined. She passed away, joining her 3 young children in the dark. The moment the time of death was officially recorded, the operational parameters of the police response underwent a stark, definitive shift. The yellow crime scene tape flapping in the evening breeze back at the site of the ambush no longer marked a horrific rescue operation. It now demarcated the epicenter of a quadruple homicide. The focus of the authorities immediately pivoted from emergency containment to retrospective analysis. They needed to understand how a man known to the system, a man with a documented history of severe domestic manipulation, had managed to maneuver himself into a position to execute his family in broad daylight. The physical crime scene was processed with grim efficiency. The forensic mapping of the burned SUV, the chemical analysis of the accelerant, and the autopsy reports provided the concrete mechanics of the massacre. But the actual investigation, the exhaustive retroactive deep dive initiated by homicide detectives, had to answer a far more disturbing question. The perpetrator was not a phantom operating in the shadows. He was a known entity to law enforcement, bound by active protective orders and thoroughly documented in the domestic violence registry. The true investigation required dissecting exactly how a man radiating such blatant lethal intent was allowed to maneuver seamlessly through the cracks of the justice system. Detectives began pulling the dispatch logs, court filings, and officer notes from the months preceding the ambush. What they uncovered was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The typical investigative hurdles usually involve a lack of evidence or silent witnesses. Here, the primary red herrings were actively manufactured by the assailant himself. He did not evade the police, he weaponized them. Whenever patrol cars responded to domestic disturbances at the marital home, he would meet them at the door with a calm, deferential demeanor. He utilized the same charismatic authority he had perfected as a fitness coach to manage the narrative. He presented himself as an exhausted, heartbroken father who was simply trying to maintain a relationship with his offspring. He effectively flipped the script, framing his estranged wife's genuine terror as an orchestrated campaign of parental alienation. He cried, he expressed deep concern for her mental health, and it worked. The system, built to adjudicate visible, physical altercations, was fundamentally unequipped to diagnose the invisible, suffocating web of coercive control. Responding officers frequently documented the encounters as standard, messy relationship breakdowns, completely missing the predatory nature of his actions. The timeline of escalation laid bare in the police files was chilling. Following the victim's narrow escape in early December, she immediately applied for a domestic violence protective order. The judicial system granted it, establishing legal boundaries that forbade him from coming within a specific radius of her or the children. But a piece of paper only works if the person it binds respects the authority of the court. He respected nothing but his own ego. The first critical failure of the safety net occurred on the morning of December 26th. While the mother was at a local park, the assailant aggressively intercepted them, physically snatching one of the daughters from the sidewalk. He threw the child into his vehicle and sped off, crossing state lines. The panic of that morning was absolute. Frantic calls were made to emergency dispatchers, reporting a kidnapping in progress. Yet the law enforcement response was completely hamstrung by the bureaucratic complexities of family law. Because the separation was recent and final custody parameters had not yet been solidified by a federal judge, the abduction was technically categorized as a civil domestic dispute. It lacked the statutory weight of a stranger kidnapping. Officers were limited in their tactical options. He essentially held the child hostage for days, using her as a bargaining chip to force communication with his estranged wife. When he eventually surrendered the girl, he faced no immediate criminal incarceration for the abduction. The message he internalized was highly dangerous. He could breach the boundaries, terrorize the family, and the system would only offer a bureaucratic slap on the wrist. The investigation revealed that he also engaged in profound legal abuse. He manipulated the family court mediation process, deliberately filing frivolous motions and demanding constant revisions to custody schedules. This was a calculated strategy to drain her remaining financial resources and legally compel her to sit in a room with him. He used the justice system to continue his harassment by proxy. The physical breaches multiplied. The files detailed a relentless campaign of stalking that carefully skirted the edges of serious criminality. He parked his car just outside the legally mandated distance from her parents' home, ensuring she saw him every time she looked out the window. He printed large photographs of her and the children and taped them to the interior windows of his vehicle, transforming his car into a rolling psychological weapon. He also escalated his technological surveillance. Detectives discovered that he had gifted the children a tablet device. Buried deep within the software folders, he had installed an application disguised as a standard family sharing program. It allowed him to secretly track their GPS coordinates in real time and remotely activate the microphone to listen to conversations inside the safe house. When the spyware was discovered and reported, the authorities logged the infraction. He was issued a minor fine and a standard warning. Time and time again, the legal apparatus evaluated these violations as isolated, low-level misdemeanors. They failed to aggregate the data. They did not see the terrifying, overarching pattern of an apex predator who had been deprived of his primary food source, control, and was rapidly running out of non-lethal options to regain it. As the timeline pushed into late January and early February, the financial and social reality of his life began to collapse. The fitness center he had leveraged for status could not function without her administrative labor. The business shuttered. His income evaporated. He was reduced to sleeping in his vehicle or crashing on the couches of remaining acquaintances. To the outside world, he painted a picture of a victimized man ruined by a vindictive spouse. But digital forensics painted an entirely different portrait. A deep dive into the cache of his confiscated laptop and mobile devices revealed a terrifying descent into tactical planning. In the weeks prior to the ambush, his internet search history shifted from fitness routines and legal advice to highly specific, violent queries. He researched the ignition points of various chemical accelerants. He spent hours reading articles about how quickly fire consumes oxygen in enclosed spaces. He looked up the mechanical vulnerabilities of heavy SUV doors. He was not experiencing a spontaneous psychological breakdown. He was meticulously drafting a blueprint for total annihilation. Perhaps the most devastating detail uncovered by the investigative team was the victim's own foresight. She had engaged extensively with domestic violence counselors and support workers. In those confidential sessions, her assessments of the threat were brutally accurate. She explicitly told caseworkers that the protective orders would not stop him. She outlined her absolute certainty that his rigid, narcissistic framework meant he would never accept her independence. The caseworkers noted her chilling premonitions. She believed he was entirely capable of taking her life. but the system demanded physical evidence to justify extreme preventative measures. Without fresh bruises to photograph, without a broken bone to catalog, the threat level remained theoretically low in the eyes of the law. Coercive control is a silent strangulation, and the legal framework was simply not designed to penalize a man for the psychological destruction he inflicted before the fatal blow was struck. The investigation ultimately concluded what she had known for months. The bureaucracy was blind, and she had been entirely on her own. Because the perpetrator chose to bleed out on the pavement, the traditional closure of a criminal trial was impossible. There would be no verdict, no sentencing, no cross-examination of the killer. The official reckoning arrived 2 years later, in March 2022, during a highly anticipated coronial inquest. Over several agonizing days, the court meticulously dissected the timeline of terror. The resulting report delivered a scathing, undeniable truth. The system had failed Hannah and her 3 children. The coroner officially determined that the perpetrator's actions were the catastrophic culmination of extreme coercive control, a psychological subjugation that law enforcement was fundamentally ill-equipped to recognize as a definitive precursor to homicide. The inquest highlighted that the assailant had effectively weaponized the justice system itself, using family court mediations, minor child retrieval disputes, and custody negotiations to maintain his suffocating grip. The final ruling explicitly stated that while responding police officers had technically followed standard operating procedures, those procedures were dangerously outdated. The authorities had been trained to look for physical bruises and broken bones, entirely missing the lethal psychological strangulation that had been tightening around the family for nearly a decade. The coroner's report became a profound, permanent indictment of a bureaucratic safety net that essentially required victims to sustain physical trauma before it would offer any tangible protection. The ashes on that suburban street eventually washed away, but the shockwave permanently altered the legal landscape. Driven by the unrelenting advocacy of her parents, sweeping legislative reforms were introduced, officially criminalizing the invisible chains of coercive control. It was a monumental victory, paid for with an unbearable price. She did not fade quietly in the shadows. She spent her final conscious moments ensuring her truth was carved into the official record, a final, unbreakable act of defiance. Her legacy is no longer defined by the man who tried to erase her, but by the systemic revolution her courage ignited. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.